The dive bar in Norfolk, Virginia was the kind of place that thrived on anonymity. It was a dimly lit cavern of worn leather, the smell of stale beer, and a jukebox that played nothing but classic rock. It was a haven for sailors on leave, tired construction workers, and locals who knew to keep their heads down. On this particular Tuesday night, the air was thick with tension, focused on a single, volatile point. Lance Corporal Kyle Riggins. Kyle was a Marine through and through. Fresh off a grueling deployment, his body was still a tightly wound coil of adrenaline and frustration. The medicated haze he was supposed to be in had been replaced by a fog of cheap whiskey, a poor decision made with his buddies from the barracks. His friends, sensing the shift in his mood, had drifted away to the pool tables, leaving Kyle alone at the bar, a ticking time bomb in a dirty t-shirt. His target, or so he thought, was a woman sitting alone at a small table near the back. She was in her late 40s, dressed in civilian clothes, simple jeans and a dark blouse that did nothing to hide a posture of quiet, absolute authority. Her name was Sarah Jenkins, and to the untrained eye, she looked like a college professor who'd wandered into the wrong bar, nursing a single glass of water while reviewing documents on a tablet. But the untrained eye, like Kyle's, was blind to the subtle signs. The way her eyes continuously cataloged every exit, every person. The way her hand rested not idly on the table, but close to her side, as if perpetually ready. To Kyle, fueled by liquid courage and a bruised ego, she was just a woman who was too quiet, too composed. In his alcohol-sodden mind, her stillness was a challenge. He'd been staring at her for 10 minutes, his gaze growing more aggressive with every sip. His buddies, who knew this look, tried to wave him down, but it was too late. Kyle slid off his bar stool, his boots thudding heavily on the sticky floor. He approached her table, a lopsided, predatory grin on his face. "What's a pretty thing like you doing all alone?" he slurred, his voice loud and invasive in the quiet corner. Sarah didn't look up from her tablet. "Waiting for a friend," she said, her voice calm, devoid of fear or invitation. It was the kind of calm that comes from staring down situations far more dangerous than a drunk Marine. Kyle, emboldened by her lack of visible reaction, misinterpreted it as weakness. He leaned forward, placing a hand on her table. "Friend? Looks to me like you just need some company. A real man's company." He puffed out his chest, the faded eagle, globe, and anchor tattoo on his forearm flexing. This time, Sarah did look up. Her eyes were a startling clear gray, and they held no anger, only a deep, weary assessment. She looked at him not as a person, but as a variable, a threat assessment. "Corporal," she said, her voice dropping a register, a flicker of command in it that any sober service member would have recognized instantly. "Go back to your friends." The word corporal should have been a bucket of ice water. It was the wrong designation. He was a lance corporal, but the tone was unmistakable. For a split second, something clicked in the back of Kyle's mind, a primal warning signal. But the whiskey was louder. He scoffed, the sound ugly and sharp. "You don't tell me what to do, lady." His right hand clenched into a fist. It was a move he'd made 1,000 times in training, a reflexive action born of instinct. He drew his arm back. In the microsecond it took for his fist to start its arc, Sarah Jenkins moved. There was no flinch, no cry of surprise. She simply wasn't there anymore. She had flowed out of her chair with a liquid grace that was impossibly fast. Her left hand shot up, not to block, but to deflect. Her palm connected with the inside of his wrist, redirecting the momentum of his punch harmlessly past her left ear. At the same time, her right leg swept forward, hooking behind his ankle. It was a simple, brutal takedown. Kyle's own drunken weight, combined with the force of his missed punch, sent him crashing to the floor. His head smacked against the leg of a nearby table, and he lay there stunned, the wind knocked out of him. The entire altercation had lasted less than 2 seconds. The bar fell silent. The jukebox played on, oblivious. Kyle's friends were on their feet, but a look from Sarah, a silent, universal command that had stopped men in their tracks on 3 continents, froze them in place. She stood over Kyle, not gloating, not angry, just waiting. She reached down and plucked a small leather credential case from her pocket, flipping it open just long enough for him to see the gold emblem and the words that didn't quite register in his scrambled brain. Two men in plain clothes who had been sitting at the bar sipping sodas were suddenly there, their hands tucking Kyle's friends back into their seats with quiet, physical insistence. One of them knelt beside Kyle. "You just made a very big mistake, son," he murmured, his voice devoid of sympathy. Sarah tucked her credentials away and picked up her tablet. She looked down at Kyle, who was now being hauled to his feet by the second agent. The fog of alcohol was rapidly being replaced by the cold, sharp terror of realization. The look in her eyes wasn't anger, it was disappointment. A deep, profound disappointment that was far worse than any rage. "Lance Corporal Riggins," she said, her voice now quiet and clear, carrying the weight of absolute authority. "You are a liability." She nodded once at the agents. "Process him, full charges, assault on a senior officer, and make sure his commanding officer gets the full report by 0600. She looked back at Kyle, who was shaking, tears of shock and pain beginning to form in his eyes. "You have no idea what you just did," she said, and for the first time, a sliver of something, pity perhaps, entered her voice. Then she was gone, melting back into the night from which she'd come, leaving Kyle Riggins to face the consequences of the punch he never landed. The sun was a brutal, unforgiving blade slicing over the horizon as Lance Corporal Kyle Riggins, still handcuffed, was delivered to the Naval Consolidated Brig Chesapeake. The previous night's drunken stupor had been replaced by a skull-splitting hangover and a gut-wrenching, soul-crushing fear. The ride in the unmarked sedan had been silent, save for the quiet radio chatter of the two men who'd arrested him. They weren't MPs, their suits were too expensive, their silence too profound. They were ghosts. The brig's intake process was a blur of fluorescent lights, bing-langed steel benches, and humiliating procedural questions. They took his clothes, his belt, his shoelaces. They gave him an orange jumpsuit that smelled of industrial bleach. He was placed in a solitary holding cell, a stark white box with a concrete slab for a bed. His head was throbbing, a dull ache from where it had hit the table, a sharp stabbing pain from the sheer impossibility of his situation. He replayed the night over and over, the woman, the quiet way she'd moved, the speed, the utter devastating efficiency of her takedown. Who the hell was she? Some kind of cop? A fed? The word senior officer echoed in his mind. He was a Marine. He knew what that meant. He'd just tried to punch an officer. It was a court-martial offense, the kind of thing that could end his career, land him in Leavenworth. But the way she'd said it wasn't like any officer he'd ever met. Around 0800, the cell door clanged open. A master-at-arms stood there, his face a mask of stone. "Riggins, you have a visitor." He was led, shackled at the wrists and ankles, to a small, windowless interview room. A single metal table was bolted to the floor, two chairs on either side. In one of them sat a man Kyle recognized instantly, Sergeant Major Marcus Thorne. Thorne was a legend in the Corps, a man with a chest full of ribbons and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. He was Kyle's battalion sergeant major, a man so far above Kyle's pay grade he might as well have been on Mars. Seeing him here in this place sent a fresh wave of ice water through Kyle's veins. Thorne didn't look angry. That would have been a relief. He looked tired and deeply, profoundly disappointed. He gestured with a granite-like hand to the empty chair. "Sit down, son." Kyle sat, his shackles clinking against the metal chair. The silence stretched for a full minute, a pressure chamber of dread. "I've read the preliminary report," Thorne finally said, his voice a low rumble. "And I've had a very interesting phone call from a colleague of the woman you decided to assault last night." Kyle opened his mouth, a flood of apologies and excuses ready to spill out. Thorne held up a hand, silencing him instantly. "You're going to listen, and you're not going to speak a single word until I'm done. Do you understand me?" Kyle nodded, mute. Thorne leaned forward, his forearms resting on the table. The woman in the bar. Her name is Sarah Jenkins. She holds the rank of, well, let's just say it's a rank that allows her to have a direct conversation with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs without having to make an appointment. Kyle's breath caught in his throat. He stared, uncomprehending. She doesn't exist on any public roster, Thorne continued, his voice dropping even lower. She doesn't have a public service record you can look up. Her official job title is a classified administrative position within the Department of Defense. In reality, she is the director of a unit you will never hear about, never see on the news, and whose operations you will never, ever know about. It's the tip of the spear, son, the absolute best of the best. Operators so skilled, so specialized, they handle the problems that don't officially exist. They go where the U.S. military can't be seen to go. They are the ghosts in the machine. And she is their leader. Thorne let the information hang in the air, a heavy, suffocating cloud. Kyle's mind reeled. He thought of his own training, his deployment, the firefights he'd been in. He thought of the quiet woman with the glass of water. It was like comparing a Cub Scout to a Navy SEAL. He hadn't just tried to punch an officer, he had tried to punch the person who commanded America's most elite, most secret warriors. The people who made the boogeyman check under his bed. She has run operations that have prevented wars, Thorne said, his voice now filled with a quiet, fierce reverence. She has brought back men and women from situations where extraction was considered impossible. She has looked evil in the eye and made it blink. And you, a drunk lance corporal in a dive bar, thought you'd teach her a lesson. The shame was a physical thing, a hot, suffocating blanket that smothered him. He felt tears prick his eyes, not of self-pity, but of pure, unadulterated mortification. Your buddies are being processed for a summary court-martial. Failure to control a fellow Marine, conduct unbecoming. They'll be demoted, fined, and given shit duty for the rest of their enlistment. They'll be lucky if they're not kicked out. Kyle thought of his friends, his only family in the Corps, and the guilt multiplied. You, Thorne said, his voice hardening, are facing a general court-martial. Assault on a superior commissioned officer. It carries a maximum sentence of dishonorable discharge, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, and 10 years in a military prison. 10 years. The words echoed in the sterile room. 10 years in Leavenworth. His life, his career, his future, gone because of one stupid, drunken swing. Thorne stared at him for a long moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of paper, folded neatly. He slid it across the table. This came for you this morning. Special delivery, direct from her office. With trembling, shackled hands, Kyle unfolded the paper. It was a single sheet with an official letterhead that simply read, Office of the Director, with a P.O. box address in Arlington, Virginia. The letter was brief, typed in a simple, clean font. Lance Corporal Riggins, I have reviewed the incident report from last night. I have also reviewed your service record. 3 years of honorable service. A commendation for action in Helmand Province. No prior disciplinary issues. I am not interested in ruining the life of a good Marine who made a terrible, alcohol-fueled mistake. The Sergeant Major will explain the terms. Consider this your one and only second chance. Do not waste it. Sincerely, S. Jenkins. Kyle read the letter 3 times. He looked up at Thorne, his eyes wide with disbelief. Thorne's expression hadn't softened, but the disappointment in his eyes had been joined by a flicker of something else. Respect. Not for Kyle, but for the woman who had written the letter. She's not pressing charges, Thorne said quietly. She's offering you a way out, but it's not a free pass. Kyle stared at the letter, the simple words burning into his brain. The most powerful woman he'd ever encountered, a woman who could have crushed him without a second thought, had shown him a mercy he didn't deserve. The weight of it was almost heavier than the threat of prison. He had been judged by a legend and found wanting. And then, she had given him a chance to be something more. 6 months later, Lance Corporal Kyle Riggins stood at parade rest outside a nondescript office building in an industrial park in Northern Virginia. There was no sign, no flag, nothing to indicate what happened inside. He was in his Service Alpha uniform, pressed to perfection. His shoes shined to a mirror gloss. The hangover from that night in Norfolk was a distant, shameful memory, but the lesson it taught him was etched into his very soul. His punishment, if it could be called that, had been a form of rehabilitation far more brutal than any prison sentence. At Sergeant Major Thorne's direction, and with the silent blessing of the letter's author, Kyle had been transferred. Not to Leavenworth, but to a unit that didn't officially exist. He was assigned as a general dog's body, a gopher, to a support unit that serviced Jenkins' organization. He was the lowest of the low, a ghost's assistant. For 6 months he had scrubbed floors, cleaned weapons, inventoried equipment, and driven supply trucks. He worked 18-hour days, surrounded by men and women who moved with the same quiet, lethal grace as the woman in the bar. He saw the aftermath of their work, exhausted operators slipping in and out of the building at all hours, the haunted looks in their eyes, the quiet professionalism with which they debriefed. He learned the true meaning of service, of sacrifice. He saw what it cost to be the tip of the spear. The bravado he'd worn like a coat in the bar was long gone, replaced by a deep, abiding humility. And now, he was here. He had been summoned. A man in civilian clothes, one of the agents from the bar, appeared at the door. He didn't smile, but his nod was less hostile than before. "She'll see you now." Kyle followed him through a maze of corridors, past secure doors that required retinal scans and coded keypads. They stopped at a simple, unmarked wooden door. The agent knocked once, opened it, and gestured for Kyle to enter. The office was small and unpretentious. A metal desk, a few filing cabinets, a large monitor on the wall showing a live satellite feed of some location he didn't recognize. And behind the desk, looking exactly as she had that night, calm, composed, utterly in control, sat Sarah Jenkins. She was reviewing a document and didn't look up immediately. Kyle stepped forward, came to attention, and rendered a sharp salute. He held it, his arm steady, his eyes fixed on a point on the wall just above her head. After a long moment, she looked up. Her gray eyes assessed him, just as they had in the bar, but this time, the weariness was gone. There was a glimmer of something else. Curiosity, perhaps. "At ease, Lance Corporal, sit down." He sat, his back ramrod straight on the edge of the chair facing her desk. "I've been getting reports on you," she said, her voice quiet. "Sergeant Major Thorne tells me you've worked hard. You've kept your head down, your mouth shut, and your eyes open." "Yes, ma'am," Kyle said, his voice barely a whisper. "He also tells me you've been asking intelligent questions, showing an interest in the logistics, the support structures. You have a good head for organization, apparently." Kyle was stunned. He'd just been trying to stay out of trouble, to be useful, to prove he wasn't the worthless drunk from that night. Jenkins leaned back in her chair. "I didn't give you that second chance because I'm a nice person, Lance Corporal. I gave it to you because I saw something in your file. A split-second decision in a firefight where you pulled a wounded Marine to cover, risking your own life. That's instinct. That's courage. That's the Marine the alcohol buried for one night. I was interested to see which one was real." She let the words sink in. "You've passed the test," she said simply. "The man who threw that punch is gone. The man sitting in front of me now has potential. Not for frontline combat, perhaps, but for something else." She slid a folder across the desk. It was stamped with the same classified markings he saw every day. "My organization runs on more than just operators with guns. We need people we can trust. People who understand the stakes, who have seen the cost, and who have proven they can be humble enough to learn. There's an opening in our strategic logistics division. It's a desk job for now, but it's a path, a chance to serve in a way you never imagined." Kyle stared at the folder. He didn't dare open it. He looked up at her, his eyes welling with tears he was too disciplined to shed. This woman, whom he had tried to assault, had not only spared him, she had given him a purpose. She had looked past his worst moment and seen a flicker of something worth salvaging. "Why?" he asked. the single word escaping before he could stop it. Sarah Jenkins allowed herself the faintest hint of a smile. It didn't reach her eyes, but it softened the hard lines of her face for just a moment. Because, Lance Corporal, America's Black Ops unit isn't just built by perfect people. It's built by people who have failed, who have learned, and who understand the weight of the responsibility they carry. You understand that weight now. You earned it the hard way. She nodded towards the folder. Read it over the weekend. Report to the address on the first page Monday morning, 0500. Don't be late. Kyle stood, came to attention, and saluted again. This time his hand was rock steady. I won't, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. He turned and walked to the door. As his hand touched the handle, her voice stopped him. Corporal Riggins? He turned. She had used his correct rank. He hadn't even noticed the promotion. The next time you're in a bar, she said, the ghost of a wry twist on her lips, maybe just stick to soda. A genuine, surprised laugh almost escaped him, but he managed to turn it into a respectful nod. Yes, ma'am, I will. He walked out of the office, clutching the folder, his past a shameful scar, his future an open, impossible book. He had been an intoxicated fool who threw a punch at a stranger. He had been given a second chance by the very person he'd wronged, and now he was going to work for her. The journey from that sticky bar floor to this quiet office had been the most brutal, transformative 6 months of his life. He was no longer just a Marine. He was, in the smallest, most nascent way, part of the Ghost unit, and he would spend the rest of his life trying to be worthy of the trust placed in him by the quiet woman with the gray eyes and the power to command the unseen.